Good evening. I stand before you as the president of National Action Network. We do not endorse candidates, but we report where candidates stand on criminal justice, economic empowerment, health equity, and other issues. On one side of this race is Donald Trump, a fellow New Yorker I've known for 40 years. Only once in that time did he take a position on racial issues. He spent a small fortune on full-page ads calling for the execution of 5 innocent young teenagers.
All right, so let's dive into this whole campaign finances thing and media appearances. You know, the kind that kind of makes you go, huh, what's going on here?
Yeah, definitely has people talking,
Yeah.
especially with this Fox News article that really brought it all to light.
Right, exactly. And that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at some donations made by Vice President Harris's campaign and how those organizations that received these donations are connected to certain media figures who then interviewed her.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, on the surface, these transactions, they might seem like pretty standard campaign procedure, but you look a little closer. The timing and the players involved, it raises some questions for sure.
For sure. Let's start with the big one. The Harris campaign donated $500,000 to Reverend Al Sharpton's National Action Network, better known as N9. And this wasn't just a one-time thing. It was split into two $250,000 donations, one in September and the other in October, just weeks before the election.
And what makes this particularly interesting is that Sharpton interviewed Harris on his MSNBC show Politics Nation on October 20th, just a few weeks after that second donation.
And MSNBC has stated that they were unaware of these donations when the interview aired.
Yeah, that definitely makes you wonder about the internal communication over there.
Yeah, it really does, especially since the interview itself took place on Harris's 60th birthday and was viewed by many as being pretty friendly, you know? Sharpton asked Harris about her legacy, compared her to the trailblazer Shirley Chisholm. It seemed like a pretty celebratory occasion.
Yeah, but this is where things get a little more complicated. The Society of Professional Journalists, the SPJ, an organization that advocates for ethical journalism, they didn't share that celebratory view. They actually called the situation a black eye for MSNBC and journalism as a whole.
Wow, a black eye, that's a pretty harsh assessment. What was it specifically that raised their concern?
Well, a reporter named Chuck Ross had been looking into this. And he noted that MSNBC just seemed to ignore any inquiries about the donations until the SPJ publicly criticized them.
That definitely doesn't look good. It kind of makes you wonder if they were hoping it would all just blow over.
Yeah, and to add another layer to all of this is all happening while MSNBC is facing its own set of challenges, declining viewership, especially after the election. Their parent company, Comcast, is in the process of spinning off its cable assets.
So this controversy is probably the last thing they needed right now.
Exactly. It puts them in a difficult position, to say the least.
Now here's where things get even more interesting. Sharpton wasn't the only media figure whose organization received money from the Harris campaign right before conducting an interview with her.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Roland Martin, for example. His company, New Vision Media, received a significant sum from the Harris campaign. $350,000 to be exact. Now, he claims that it was for advertising, but again, the timing is curious.
Yeah, it definitely raises questions. Why would the campaign choose to spend such a large amount of money on advertising with this specific company so close to the election and right before he interviewed Harris?
Exactly. And then there's the Oprah factor. Oprah Winfrey's Harpo Productions received a cool $1 million. Allegedly for production costs related to a town hall and some appearances with Harris at rallies.
Although sources close to the Harris campaign suggest that the total cost for those Oprah events was actually closer to $2.5 million. Quite considerable discrepancy there.
Wow. So a lot more money may have been involved than initially reported. Seems like there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. Makes you wonder about the bigger picture here.
It does, and that's what we're going to delve into further. These financial transactions, while they're raising eyebrows, they're not necessarily illegal.
Yeah.
But they do highlight kind of a gray area when it comes to campaign finances and these media interactions.
Right. It's not always so black and white. There's not a law that says you can't donate to organizations connected to media figures who then interview you. But it certainly creates the appearance of a conflict of interest.
Exactly. And that's what's so important to consider here. Even the perception of impropriety can erode public trust. And we can't afford to take that lightly.
Especially these days where people are already so skeptical of the media and politicians in general.
Right. It's crucial for people to recognize that these kinds of relationships exist and to understand how they might be influencing the information that we receive. I mean, think about it. If you knew that a journalist had received a large sum of money from a candidate's campaign just before interviewing them, wouldn't that color how you view the interview?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I would definitely be wondering, are they going easy on the candidate because of that financial tie?
And that's a perfectly valid concern. We should always be critical consumers of information, especially when it comes to politics.
So what can we do? What can we as news consumers do to ensure that we're getting the full story?
Well, I think first and foremost, diversify your media diet. Don't rely on just one source for your news. Read articles from different publications, watch programs from different networks, listen to podcasts with a variety of different viewpoints.
It's like having a balanced diet, but for your news intake.
Exactly. Just as you wouldn't want to only eat one type of food, you shouldn't limit yourself to just one perspective.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's about getting a more well-rounded view of the situation and not just accepting one narrative as the absolute truth.
Right, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Dig a little deeper, challenge the information that you're presented with.
So it's about being an active participant and staying informed, rather than just passively consuming whatever's thrown our way.
Exactly, and that involves being critical of the sources that you're getting your information from. Consider their motivations, their biases, their track records.
We talk a lot these days about fake news and misinformation, but it's not always about these blatant lies. Sometimes it's more subtle, like presenting a story in a way that favors a particular agenda or a narrative.
And that's why it's so important to be aware of these nuances,
Mm-hmm.
these subtle ways in which information can be manipulated or presented with a certain spin.
It's like a magic trick. If you know how it's done, it's not as impressive anymore.
Oh, I like that. So it's about kind of demystifying the process, understanding how these things work so we're not so easily swayed by clever framing or biased presentation.
Okay, so we need to diversify our media intake. We need to be critical of our sources, not be afraid to ask questions. What else? What else can we do to sort of navigate this complex media landscape?
Pay attention to the language that's being used. Notice how certain words or phrases are being used to frame a story or to elicit a particular emotional response.
Yeah, language is powerful. It can really shape our perceptions and influence our opinions. It's like how advertisers use those catchy slogans and emotionally charged words to persuade us to buy their products.
Exactly. The same techniques are often used in news reporting to subtly influence how we view a particular event or individual.
It's almost like subliminal messaging, but with words.
In a way, yes. And we need to be aware of these tactics so we don't let them subconsciously sway our opinions.
So it's about reading between the lines, paying attention to the details, and not just taking things at face value.
Exactly. It's about becoming more media literate, more aware of the techniques that are used to try to shape our perceptions, and more discerning in our consumption of information.
And I imagine this is all especially important when it comes to political coverage.
Absolutely. Political decisions have a direct impact on our lives. So it's crucial that we're well informed, able to make decisions based on accurate and unbiased information.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of media literacy and critical thinking in general, but let's bring it back to the Harris campaign and those media donations. What are the key takeaways from this specific situation? What can we learn from it?
Well, I think it highlights the need for greater transparency in both the media and in politics.
Transparency is definitely a buzzword these days, but what does it really mean in this context?
Well, it means being open and honest about financial transactions, potential conflicts of interest, and really any factors that might influence editorial decisions.
So it's about being upfront with the audience and letting them know about any potential biases that might be at play.
Exactly. It's about empowering the audience to make informed decisions about the information they're consuming.
And it's not just about the media being transparent. Political campaigns also need to be more open about their spending and their relationships with these media organizations.
Absolutely. We need to know where the money is coming from and how it's being used to try to influence public opinion.
It's about shining a light on the inner workings of the system, so to speak.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important takeaway from this situation, the need for accountability.
Yeah, accountability for both the media and for political campaigns. It can't just be a one-way street.
Right, exactly. The media needs to be accountable to its audience for providing accurate and unbiased information while being transparent about any potential conflicts of interest.
And campaigns need to be accountable for how they're spending their money and for the relationships that they cultivate with media organizations.
It's about creating this system of checks and balances, where both sides are held to a high standard of conduct.
So how do we actually implement this accountability? I mean, it's easy to talk about it in theory, but how do we make it happen in practice?
Well, there are several approaches I think we could consider. One option is to strengthen existing regulations around campaign finance disclosure. Make it mandatory for campaigns to report any donations made to organizations that are affiliated with media figures who are covering the campaign.
Okay, so that would increase transparency and make it harder for campaigns to hide these kinds of financial ties.
Exactly. And it would give the public more information so they could
Yeah.
make more informed judgments about the information they're receiving.
But wouldn't that be a lot of work for campaigns to track and report all those donations? And wouldn't it potentially discourage them from supporting legitimate media organizations?
Yeah, those are valid concerns. And that's why any changes to campaign finance regulations would need to be carefully considered, implemented in a way that doesn't stifle legitimate political activity or free speech.
So that's one potential solution. Focusing on campaign finance regulations, what other approaches could we explore?
Well, we could also look at strengthening the ethical guidelines for journalists.
Oh, interesting. How would that work?
Well, a lot of media organizations already have their own internal codes of ethics, but we could potentially develop some industry-wide standards that specifically address conflicts of interest related to campaign finance.
So something like requiring journalists to disclose any financial ties that they or their organizations have to political campaigns.
Exactly. And maybe even recusing themselves from covering those campaigns if there's a perceived conflict of interest.
Those sound like some pretty reasonable measures to ensure journalistic integrity and maintain public trust. But even with stricter regulations and guidelines, wouldn't it still be possible for campaigns and media organizations to find loopholes or ways to circumvent the rules?
You're right, there's no foolproof system. But that's where I think public awareness and media literacy really come into play.
So it always comes back to us, being informed and engaged citizens.
Exactly. The more we understand about these issues, the more likely we are to demand better from both our media and our political leaders.
So to our listeners out there, we leave you with this. How can we as individuals contribute to a more transparent and accountable system? When it comes to campaign finances and media coverage, what role can we play in ensuring that the information we receive is accurate and unbiased and presented with integrity? Think about it. Let us know your thoughts. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.